thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very happy to get back here. And having been here at a previous occasion, I know that you are a very lively intellectual group, which asks some very probing theoretical questions. And what I want to do is, in fact, kind of throw my work into the field here, into the territory of your discussions in a somewhat workshop-like fashion. Because I know that you are thinking a lot about space and landscape geographies, cultural geographies perhaps, political geography perhaps, and reflecting questions of territoriality, space, colonization perhaps, all these issues. While I have been thinking quite a bit about what you might call the spatial term in also science and technology studies, and I've been thinking very much about, in some ways, placing the development of science and technology into a historical and temporal horizon on the one hand, and in a more spatial horizon on the other hand. So while I've been doing all of that, I have not really done that from the point of view of, you might call it cultural geography, and not really from a theoretical conception of what it means to conceive of, you might say, the spatial term. So I want to offer some of my thoughts to your critical questions in this regard. Now, so I will make a very general political point first, and then I will give you a very specific historical example. And the historical example is not so old; it's like 15 years old. So it's not very deep history. So and the very basic political point I'm trying to make is to say that when we talk about so-called emerging technologies, right? I mean, this is a word that is being used a lot to talk about artificial intelligence, about nanotechnology, about synthetic biology, and so forth. These are supposed to be emerging technologies, and in German we even have the nice word Zukunftstechnologien. They are technologies of the future. Right? So when we use this metaphor of emergence and future, we already kind of set a stage for a certain way of discussing and thinking about these technologies. And this is very much the background in which we say, okay, these are things that might come, that will come, that are probably coming. These are things that we better prepare for in some ways or another. It is sometimes we think of it as a future that is in the making, in the laboratories, and it's sort of articulating itself, and we have to respond to it, right? I mean, that is sort of a very basic picture which we are confronted with all the time. So there is a lot of discussions, a lot of conferences about the future of work, the future of mobility, the future of the human being, the future of whatever, right? So especially in Germany, I don't know whether, but I imagine that also you have similar kind of discussions. So emerging technologies, Zukunftstechnologien, are being framed as sort of programs for shaping the future, programs for what will and might happen, which is about to happen as we follow up on new technologies. And I want to say that there are very good and important political reasons to look at, to refuse that language, and to not look at these in terms of their kind of promises of the future, but to look at these technologies as conquests of space, as forms of colonization. And that actually, if you look at the programs of these technologies more closely, we will find that this is really even, you might say, the predominant mode in which they actually proceed. But when I say there are political reasons for that, what I want to also say is that by doing so, by looking at it as a kind of spatial conquest, or as conquest of space, certain things become visible that are otherwise not. Okay, and especially what becomes visible is some of the, in some sense, politics of what has been recently called techno-scientific constitutionalism that is involved. But this, and now I'm prefacing it already, and this is already one place where I'm presenting this to your consideration. This, for me to say, is something very difficult. It's not easy for me to say that we should look at the conquest of space and the management, the control of space, as the place where we can make the politics of technology and science visible. And the reason for this being difficult is precisely because for me, as a kind of enlightenment product, politics has to do with temporality and history, right? So we can't really imagine, I can't really imagine politics without some notion of a better world, some notion of the good life, some kind of negotiations about how we shall live. That seems to be the essence of politics. So why am I now saying that we should sort of refuse the futuristic discourse and instead focus on this sort of issue of the conquest of space? Why am I saying that it is here that the politics becomes more visible? And I think this is a bit paradoxical, in fact, and I want to show, I want to basically indicate here to you why it makes sense to me, even though it is a very, very long road. Okay, so this is just the first preface, and then comes the second preface, and then I will finally show you some documents. I don't actually, as you see, I don't have a regular PowerPoint presentation. I will just show you some documents as we go along. So I mentioned this word techno-scientific constitutionalism. And there was a recent conference in Washington, D.C. actually, but it was a German-American conference, and it was very much focused around the ideas of Sheila Jasanoff, and you may know some of you may know her as one of the major scholars in science and technology studies, who thinks a lot of on the question of the relationship of technology and the law, and the kind of concept that connects these two domains is the concept of the norm. So the law sets norms in a sense, and the law is a kind of, is actually, you might say the law is itself a kind of technology, social technology, in which norms get instituted, regulated, administered, managed, renegotiated. But at the same time, technology, to her mind, and that's something she works out, produces norms that challenge the legal system on the one hand, but that also take on a kind of almost like a legal standing. And that's what she means by technological constitutionalism. So the most obvious example, this sounds very abstract, so I'll give you an example that makes a lot of sense. The most obvious example is notions of parenthood. So I mean, that's a big thing in the law, right? A lot of custody battles, a lot of lawsuits are being fought over who is the parent of whom and what rights do they have for that. And now you have the story of someone like Craig Venter saying that he created an organism, the first organism that had a computer as a parent, that didn't have biological parents, right? Or, of course, more familiar to us are the debates from reproductive technologies, where you might have someone being born who has two biological mothers, and maybe one biological father, but also a legal father, and so forth and so on. Very complicated relationships, which do not, in some sense, the law is not made to reflect them on some level. At the same time, the law has to sort of accommodate these new facts that are being created, these new structures that are being established through technological innovation. And the question, of course, to be asked is, what kind of legitimacy do these changes actually have? I mean, these are not laws that are passed through the regular process of, a kind of constitutional getting together of parliamentarians who then negotiate and then pass a law. I mean, this idea that someone can have two biological mothers is not something that you can define or undefine through just a simple discursive negotiation. It somehow is established in a different way, through the back door, if you will, or behind our backs, if you will. So the question is then how to reclaim the politics of these kinds of developments, how to talk about this in a political way. And strangely, of course, there is not a single person that you can address. I mean, these technologies don't have propagandists. I mean, there is no one saying we ought to have a new family where people have two biological mothers. No one is making that claim. It's not a normative claim in that sense, right? But at the same time, we want to make the technology available to to many people who are trying to become pregnant, right? To try out this option of having two biological mothers for one child, right? So we want to make this available. At the same time, there is no, in some sense, justificatory, legitimatory discourse attending it. So and that is one reason why I think one needs to really look at the technological infrastructures, the socio-technical working orders themselves, in terms of what kind of politics they embody, in order, as a first step, to even make these issues available for kind of public discourse and public discussion, and maybe for consideration of alternatives. The future-oriented discourse, in some sense, veils these changes and veils these structures, because it only proclaims that the world, the future will be different, and that something is coming. So in some sense, it names the normative changes, but it doesn't allow us to, in some sense, enter into the texture, into the relations, into the manufacture of these new constitutional facts. So that is just my preface. Okay, so this sounds extremely abstract, and I hope not too abstract, about why I think I want to bring in questions of space and spatial consideration, and to understand how technical systems can create solidarity, for example, through forms of participation, how technical systems can exert violence, of course, as they modify and change social relationships, at the same time, of course, as they are appropriated and accommodated. And as technical systems obtain robustness and become established, this seems to be the analog to what we used to be called political justification. And that does seem to be the ground of justification. So a kind of functional validation takes or appropriates the place of technical, of political legitimacy, right? And this is a scandal to our classical ways of thinking about politics, but the scandal has to be articulated, has to be spelled out, given a name. All right, so that's why I'm saying that it might be better to understand emerging technologies as programs for the discovery and conquest of space. And when we do that, what comes to view is maybe something, in some sense, is also the conceit of these technologies, the promise that borders on the absurd. And I think when we behold these absurdities, for example, and come to terms with them, or try to come to terms with them, this is already one way in which a form of reflection can begin that might also question technologies or raise issues about alternatives. So what I want to do now is actually give you one example of this. It's one extended example, and it's not it's on the one hand an example about a particular technology, namely nanotechnology primarily, but at the same time, as you will see, it involves the whole idea of what you might call sustainable development, and so a larger sort of ideological framework. And I want to show for the nanotechnologies, but I think it can be done similarly for others, how close the promise and the desperation and the anxiety and all these things are sort of wrapped in to this space-specific program of conquering space. So what I will do is show you 3 documents and 3 different documents, and they will make it very clear how nanotechnology is, of course, a space technology, and then again at the end I'll be talking about sustainable development, planetary boundaries, the larger sort of ideological promise that is implicit in nanotechnology. And so let me begin by showing you this document here. So let's see whether I can make it a bit bigger. Okay, that should be a way to do it. Right. I don't know. It doesn't matter. You see it well enough now. Okay. So here you already have a very clear image of nanotechnology as space technology or as a conquest of space. I'll just leave it at that. So what is the document that I'm showing you? This is not it's actually, historically speaking, a very important document, because this is the document by which the American public, but also American lawmakers in particular, were introduced to nanotechnology. This was like when the so-called nanotechnology initiative, the National Nanotechnology Initiative in the United States was founded. And of course it demanded a lot of grant money and financial support. And this was the document that was produced to show that this support should be given. And what you see here is the cover page, and I could show you some of the inside too. It's very interesting, but the cover page in itself tells a very nice story. Okay, so because we have here literally an image of space exploration, right? And it's a very familiar image. And on the one hand, nanotechnology, like all these emerging technologies, plays with the notion of the unheard of, the dramatically transformative, the way in which nothing will be as it was. Everything will be different. But at the same time, the images used, of course, are familiar images. And here it is classically an image of space travel. And to my mind, actually, there's a strong resonance here to the movie 2001: Odyssey in Space. I'm not sure whether you think of this in that way. It's a famous film by Stanley Kubrick, which has a kind of a sort of strange material, magnetized, abstract object traveling through the universe. And here, this object is something else. I mean, it is also actually a surface, mostly, but it is a surface that is being investigated by one of the tools of nanotechnology, a scanning tunneling microscope, so we see the surface structure. The surface in question is actually a silicon type material. So we also have here the story that this is microtechnology being sort of superseded by the next stage. I mean, microtechnology, of course, was the technology that already changed everything once, right? And now we move on the size scale from micro to nano. And the promise here is that this will be similarly revolutionary, that nanotechnology is the next chapter after microtechnology, after electronics, after the computer. And it will have a similarly strong impact. So the fact that nanotechnology is space travel is of course also underwritten by the very notion of nano, which is often called nanospace, the nanocosm. It's often described as the sort of the space, the size regime, sort of between classical physics and quantum physics, just above the electrons and small atoms, sort of. But sort of at the molecular scale. So it's the smallest scale at which you can still have something that has a semblance of being an entity, but it already has some very strange properties. But what is the object of this space travel, right? And this kind of conquest of space. So why should we embark on this journey? And so I will show you another document which gives us the story about that. And that second document is referenced as a kind of mythical origin story of nanotechnology. So nanotechnology began in 1999, 2001, somewhere around that period, which is when this publication was published. But in these publications, there was another reference point always given, and that other reference point goes back to 1959, when of course no one would actually do something like nanotechnology, when it was not even quite an idea yet. But in 1959, a very famous physicist, Richard Feynman, gave a lecture, and this lecture is often called sort of the announcement of nanotechnology, that it would happen sooner or later, that it would come, the basic program of nanotechnology developed, took its point of origin there. Richard Feynman, interestingly enough, is also brought in as a kind of often as a founding figure for synthetic biology too. I mean, they love to reference the famous physicist, right, who was a theoretical physicist, as one to kind of be a patron saint, you might say, of this new endeavor. So let's look at Feynman's text. So this is Feynman's text. Initially appeared in this journal here, Engineering and Science, in February 1960. Again, his lecture was in 1959 at Caltech, California Institute of Technology. And the reason why I picked this original publication rather than a reprint is because you can see very quickly, just by glancing through this brochure, what the obsession is in 1959. It's already here. You can see that there are two major entrances in this journal. One is called The Importance of Space, one lecture, and the other one was called There's Plenty of Room at the Bottom. There's Plenty of Room at the Bottom was the Feynman lecture, and The Importance of Space was the lecture by the president of Caltech. Now both of them talk about space, but they talk about different kinds of space. But just as in the brochure that I showed you earlier, Shaping the World Atom by Atom, those two ideas of space travel become merged. I think Feynman was he was known to be a kind of humorous person. I think he kind of had fun to present this other form of space travel. But if you look at this journal, you will see that everything in it, especially the advertisements, which are all directed at future engineers, right? This is the next generation of engineers in 1959, 1960. What were they supposed to do? They were supposed to go to outer space. I mean, this is what it's an amazing number of, it's an amazing number of ads here which have to do the biggest thirst in the universe, and then there comes The Importance of Space, and then there comes There's Plenty of Room at the Bottom by Richard Feynman. And this idea of Feynman's is of course quite a provocation, right? Because when we talk about space travel, about outer space, what we imagine is a kind of futuristic vision of human beings leaving the planet, colonizing outer space, quite literally, right? Quite literally building platforms where new forms of life can emerge. So life colonies on Mars, and going to the moon, all these things, where you have real sort of human scale people moving about, making a livelihood, right? Now, when Feynman talks about there's plenty of room at the bottom, and he talks about a different kind of space travel that takes us inside the molecular level, he is also talking about a space which provides a huge resource for human development, as I will show more in more detail. And he's quite serious about that, and actually his successors are even more serious about that, even though it's not a space that anyone can literally go into. Right, so here he's saying it's an invitation to enter a new field of physics. Again, it's a kind of an invitation to travel. It's an invitation to enter a place, and of course, what he will say about the space is indeed. I mean, there are many things that you can say are kind of prophetic of nanotechnology. He says this field is like solid-state physics in the sense that it doesn't really tell us something of very great theoretical importance. We don't actually learn a lot of new physics that way, but it shows us something about the complexity of the world, and there are lots of strange phenomena that we will encounter, and it has enormous number of technical applications. But how? I'll show you just a few more pictures about space travel in this journal issue here. So there's space everywhere. So you task, of course, also for the future to go into space and to claim the space for yourself. Space age challenge. It's literally all around you. Okay. So So this is the context in which nanotechnology, in some sense, was framed as a form of space exploration. But how can we take this seriously, right? Is this more than a joke to say, look, everyone, all the engineers in the whole world want to go to outer space. I'll tell you another direction to go. Go into inner space, go into the space, the nano space, right? Is that more than a joke? And I want to say, yes, it is more than a joke, and especially it became much more than a joke as we went on. Because when we talk in 1999, right, we talk a lot 40 years later, hardly anyone talks about colonizing space anymore. I mean, we still want to do some scientific work up there, and maybe do some manufacturing there. There's some basic science issues to be solved by sending probes into space, but no one is seriously pursuing a program of building space colonies. So this idea of wanting to go and secure a kind of human existence by going into space, this idea has vanished. And the new space exploration, the nanotechnology space exploration, becomes an all the more important substitute when we look at scarce resources, especially in terms of literally physical space and energy. And what I want to say is that when Feynman proclaims and the nanotechnologists proclaim that there is plenty of room at the bottom, what they are actually saying is that there is much more space on Earth than meets the eye. We have more space than we think. So the whole thinking behind this form of space exploration is that we are wrong to think that our planet is a limited resource. And this is, I think, also the ultimate conceit, maybe the ultimate absurdity, but also the ultimate promise of nanotechnology. And I think absurdity and promise lie here very close together, that the Earth is in fact not limited, that we don't know what the limits are of resources, both in terms of physical space, literally, and energy. So, and of course this sounds strange, and I think to become aware of this kind of strangeness is part of the program I'm trying to develop and proceed to pursue. So, how can there be more space on Earth when the Earth is clearly a bounded system, it seems to us, right, with limited sources of space and energy? Have we not learned from our discourse of environmentalism, right, that our blue planet, our spaceship Earth, as it was sometimes called, right, is like a small vessel that travels through the solar system, right? We are all aware of the famous image of the blue planet that was also a product of the space age, the 1960s, and the discovery of the Earth, which was as a planet, which was celebrated as maybe the real impact of the moon travels. And from that image of the beautiful but precious, like jewel-like small planet that sort of travels the darkness of the solar system, one developed at the time ideas of this being literally like a ship, like a spaceship Earth. And the ship is like any other ship. If it's too full, if there's too many people there, it will go under. Right? It's like a rescue ship. It has a certain carrying capacity. That was the metaphor used at the time of the 1960s, 1970s. The carrying capacity of the Earth as a limited capacity. So if there are too many people on board, the ship will go under. Right? So the population bomb, they talked about the population bomb, the population problem was seen as a problem of a population growth that cannot be sustained because the Earth had a limited carrying capacity. And so this was the language that was used. And in terms of this kind of language, there was only one escape, and there was indeed the escape if you wanted to have continuing population growth, is to leave the Earth and find other spaces where we could live, to colonize space. Again, this was the 60s, the 70s perhaps still, when this was an idea. But now we are supposed to fathom the notion that, in fact, there is no limit, and that the notion of the carrying capacity is the wrong metaphor, and that also the idea of the spaceship, the small vessel that only holds so many people, is not actually the guiding metaphor in the age of nanotechnology, because the conquest of space and that is pursued by nanotechnology actually is meant to disclose new space and show us how much more space there is. There's plenty of room at the bottom. This is what Feynman was saying. So, but how shall we actually imagine that? So I need to at least quickly give you some indication of how the nanotechnologies might argue for this, right? I mean, so how can we argue for there being all this space that we don't even know about, and also so much more energy? So nanotechnology and other emerging technologies re-envision the Earth as unlimited, or at least they envision the planet as a body, the limits of which are yet unknown. We are still discovering whether there are any limits and where they are. And they do not do so metaphorically, but quite literally. And I think need to at least give you some indication that there is a literal sense of this idea of disclosing space. And I will just give you now we'll talk like a nanotechnology enthusiast who is explaining to people in high school, why they should be so excited about nanotechnology. So this is a very simple story that I'm telling. So the argument for unlimited space runs as follows, right? Just as mathematicians who are interested in fractal geometry can ask, how long is the coastline of England? And perhaps this problem, right? How long is it's sort of a famous thing, and the idea is that the closer you look, the longer it gets, right? If you really draw out every little jagged piece of sand at the beach, you start adding up a lot of centimeters and inches and so forth, and the coastline of England actually becomes incredibly long, much longer than you would think. If you just look at a globe or at the atlas, right? So the way you look, sort of in some sense, extends the length of the coastline, and a very similar argument can be made for the disclosure of space through nanotechnology. Right? The argument is about mostly the famous case is always take a wooden cube, like 10 times 10 centimeters, right? The cube is robust, it's bulk matter, right? And we can figure out how much surface it has, right? How much surface does this cube have? It has 6 sides, 10 times 10 centimeters, so 6 times 100 centimeters, so it's 600 square centimeters is the surface of this cube. And we can take the cube, and it's very robust, and and we can throw the cube through a flame, and nothing will happen, and so on, right? And now what nanotechnologists say, what we do is we cut this cube into pieces, right? So we divide it. So we make the same cube into 8 little cubes, right? And now add the surface of those 8 little cubes, and they'll be already more than our initial surface, right? And then we start cutting down more and more and more, and that's the progress of nanotechnology, right? That we disclose more and more surface area in bulk matter, right? And so that in some sense there is literally more space. Whether this is a meaningful notion of having more space, I mean, it's obviously the discussion that one needs to have, right? But initially here, it's that on the one hand, more space is discovered until the end point. We have what you might call almost only surfaces, right? I mean, nanotechnology, strictly speaking, is a surface science where the majority of atoms are at the surface of the material. So that's why people talk about 2-dimensional materials or even 1-dimensional materials. So it's not really bulk matter anymore. And once you have this kind of material, you also have these surprising new properties, right? And again, the case of the wooden cube is a nice case because you don't even have to do nanotechnology, you just get to the level of sawdust. Once you have, it's all just dusty, and you throw the sawdust through the flame, you will find that it combusts, right? So a new property emerges. The wood has a new property in virtue of the fact that the bulk to surface relationship has changed, right? And this idea that somehow by just disclosing these powers that come with the discovery of these vast surfaces beyond, of course, human access, or immediate human access, this idea is seen as this enormous resource that remains untapped, that has remained untapped so far, and that now with nanotechnology we can uncover. So we might think of this as a naive kind of technological argument, but that's exactly one reason why I think it is important not just to look at the grand promises of a new form of life, but to actually look at these arguments and see how incommensurate they are with other traditional ways of thinking about resources, economizing, housekeeping, zero-sum games, and so forth, which have sort of informed our political and economic thinking, and also our theories of justice, and so on, and how suddenly we get this other discourse about sort of, in some sense, unlimited surfaces, unlimited resources of space, which seem to defy this form of economic thinking within limits, and within limits of growth, for example. So a similar case can be made about energy, and it's even more easy to understand, I think, for all of us, because we don't need to know anything about nanotechnology, because we live in the age of so-called renewable energies, which are premised on the sun, the gift of the sun, right? And which again are premised on this idea that, in fact, the human energy use is not constrained by fossilized fuels, right, which are already just the work of the sun that has been sedimented over many decades and centuries and geological time, but that in fact there's maybe this way of sort of speeding up the process, right? We don't have to wait for energy to become fossilized, deposited in the ground. We can maybe skim off the gift of the sun in a more immediate way and kind of use that as a kind of infinite, literally again, infinite supply of energy. Here we also have perhaps, you might say, economic concepts coming in through thinkers like Georges Bataille, who already in the middle of the 20th century was trying to distinguish two kinds of economy, namely what he called the specific economy, a kind of scientific economy of zero-sum games, where everything has a price, where things, of course, have limits, and then there's this other kind of economy which we call the general economy, which is one that cannot be scientific, in part because scientific thinking does require a kind of framing in terms of calculation and of limits. So his idea is that we have this excessive exuberance, this overwhelming gift of energy from the sun, which leads to this almost, you might say, a kind of orgy of life and death in the biospheres. So the gift of the sun fosters dreams of a way of life that no longer relies on the storage of solar energy in fossil fuels, but learns to accelerate its circulation. I think that is pretty much a kind of commonplace in our contemporary discourse. All right, so now let me get to the last document, because I think I think it just gives us a sense of where this is all leading, or it's a kind of parallel sort of ideological development. And this would be the so-called Grundland report, which is the report which established the idea of sustainability. And when I was talking earlier about our traditional ways of thinking, which are very much involved, or I have to find this page. I did not find it that way. All right, sorry. So it's kind of cruel to show you this version of the report, but I kind of like the fact that this was still produced, this futuristic vision was produced at a time where very old-fashioned technology was used to prepare the reports of the United Nations, so it's still typewritten. So this, I mean, I don't know how you read these reports. I mean, the idea of sustainable development, as you know, uses as its definition one that may have been derived from the philosophy of Hans Jonas, which is a kind of imperative to manage the earth in such a way that future generations will have their own resources and capabilities of developing their ideas of the good life, right? So we shall not live at the expense, so to speak, of the future generations. But this might easily be associated with the classical conservationist attitude, where you say, well, we have to be frugal, we have to be careful with our use of resources, because we have to make sure that our children inherit enough, right? But this is in fact not how the Grundland report argues. It does not say, be careful with the energy resources that you have, because your children want to have some of them too. It's more like, just make sure that there is a kind of potential of growth, a potential of technological development, a potential of space and energy exploration, which allows future generations to keep doing the same thing as wastefully as you are, right? So it's about sustaining certain ideas. It's not about conserving a kind of resource. It's about sustaining a process. And so it will actually say here very explicitly, actually I think on the next page, this is the chapter 2 on towards sustainable development, where this is formulated and says this, actually maybe this down here, sorry. The satisfaction of human needs and aspirations is the major objective of development, and then it speaks about a world in which poverty and inequity are endemic, will always be prone to ecological and other crises. So sustainable development requires meeting the basic needs of all and extending to all the opportunity to satisfy their aspirations. Okay, so this much is clear, but then it will actually say quite explicitly that growth has no set limits. There it is on paragraph 1. At the bottom here, the growth has no set limits in terms of population or resource use, beyond which lies ecological disaster. So this is a clear rejection of a certain way of thinking about carrying capacities. It's a rejection of this metaphor that spaceship Earth will sink if it is overused, right? That there is kind of catastrophe just as soon as there are too many people on Earth, as we overtax our resources, right? It rejects that idea. And it actually refers to two different solutions. One is the accumulation of knowledge and the development of technology can enhance the carrying capacity of the resource base. So the carrying capacity is nothing fixed, right? But it can be itself enhanced. And the joker is technology, right? And so we can. So technology is actually the answer to can only answer the question in its sort of pursuit, where the limits might lie. So So that's why nowadays we don't speak about carrying capacity anymore, but about ecological footprints, for example. And you know that the ecological footprint is not a measure of sort of, you know, there's one Earth and if we reach the limit then there's catastrophe. But the ecological footprint is a measure of how much surface area of the Earth does a person in the United States, a person in India, a person in Russia require, right? And then we add all this up. And then we come to the conclusion that we are already using 1.5 or 1.7 times the Earth's surface, right? So we are already exceeding what on the calculation of the ecological footprint should be the maximum, right? So the ecological footprint is an invitation to ask how much more can we get out of this planet, right? So technology, and also there's an appeal here to also social reforms are our ways to enhance the resource base, is our way to discover just how much more does this planet offer, how much more in terms of space and energy. So it fits perfectly with this. I mean, you might even say that this is, you might say, the underlying program, which is executed by nanotechnology, right? And so here clearly there is an appeal to emerging technologies, right? Because these technologies, we are sort of betting on the possibility of future technologies. So anyhow, all right. So I think I should come to the conclusion. This was only meant to be a case study again for this more general interest of mine to say, what if we tell stories about the conquest of space, nanotechnologies, emerging technologies as space technologies, and how can we maybe exhibit, as I try to do here, the limits and the absurdities and the promises, of course, too, and the ideology, how, in some sense, thinking about the economy, about ecology, about housekeeping and dealing with limits is undermined through this form of space exploration. And so I mean, clearly we don't know how we can actually respond or adapt to this story, right? I mean, it is in some sense our story, these stories of nanotechnology and emerging technologies. These are the stories that get repeated to us all the time as we look at technological programs. Should we really, in some sense, as the Brundtland report suggests, bet our future on the credibility of these seductive and questionable promises? So this is the questions I want to ask. And I'll just leave it with that.
General question. First of all, thank you for this very interesting presentation. And my question is dedicated to the. Can you please clarify the interconnections between the ideology of sustainable development and the philosophical heritage of Hans Jonas? Because you are talking about this, but I want just to kind of a brief elucidation of this issue.
Okay, I mean, I'm not entirely sure what the genealogy is here. I mean, there were some philosophers in the Brundtland Commission who might have known Jonas's work, but maybe not. I mean, maybe there is no direct link. But what I see is that this general maxim is also in Jonas's work, that we have to live in such a way that future generations can live. I don't know whether he himself would make the distinction that I'm making here, the distinction between passing on the resources, so to speak, right? Keeping the German word would be Bestand, you know, that's the famous Heideggerian word, the kind of a possession, right? Like literally an inheritance, right? So we pass on, in a physical sense, the necessary means for survival, right? Versus just being able to pass on the promise of technological development and economic growth that might satisfy the future generations, right? So this is a distinction that the Brundtland report, I think, is making, that Jonas, I don't think, is making.
Thank you. Okay. So maybe then I make a comment and then we pass to some more general things. So while I was preparing for this comment and for this talk, first of all I tried to figure out for myself the aspects and details of the spatial turn within STS and within analysis of technology, just to have a clearer and more detailed picture. And I identified some kind of concepts, or let's say layers of interest that complement each other and kind of develop mutually. So first of all, we can probably speak about the shift from seeing scientific knowledge and scientific practice as something universal and neutral towards cultural geography of science and seeing scientific practice as something connected to localities, something connected to specific places where knowledge is produced and practiced. Then we can probably speak about closer attention not only to places where knowledge is produced, but also to some kinds of movements between spaces, movements of knowledge and ideas between different laboratories, between the lab and the kind of outer world, which is manifested in the concepts of knowledge in transit or some trading zones, so the importance of movement between. And then, developing this narrative, we can look at the objects themselves, at material things, at technologies, as manifestations of this kind of movement. So if we speak about the movement between scientific community and lab and the outer world, which is manifested in the concepts like, for instance, boundary objects, which is the concept by Susan Leigh-Starr, or Latour's immutable mobile, so when things, when objects are seen as manifestations of movements of ideas, knowledge, and things. But objects and material things can not only be that kind of expression of movement, but they can be seen as spatial objects in themselves, as we saw in this subtle and sophisticated account of emerging technologies and nanotechnologies as spatial or even geographic endeavors. So nanotechnologies, as it was said, as it was shown, they are about, well, in the first place, kind of transgressing physical space or rather physical scale. They are about control, control over the structure of matter, control over maybe even the building blocks of life, and these aspects of control are kind of implied, they exist within nanotechnologies. So they are about, and this control is about to see things at a small scale, to be able to move around this small scale and to move these things around, to operate in this small scale. And this, of course, somehow affects and has an impact on, once again, scientific practices and scientific knowledge, because with the example of nanotechnologies, we see the abstract knowledge, well, abstract atomic knowledge complemented or even converged with the necessity and ability, technical ability to create. And here, scientific knowledge is connected with the necessity to produce, so the desired result of technoscience is an object. And these aspects of control, production, and technical abilities are connected with the thesis that was highlighted about technology being able to produce social orders, or technology and social sphere being able to co-produce social orders. Then getting back to kind of spatial description or spatial talk about nanotechnologies, they seem to be both about expansion of scale, expansion of the planet, the boundaries, and the space that is possible to use, but they're also about intervention, and this idea of intervention always is brought about, it always kind of seen there. It's about intervention into some conventional practices, into the order of things, even into the body, if we can consider human body a kind of battleground or space for science and technology. But another, probably even the most important observation is that the spatial description is inseparably connected with temporal description. So space here is very closely connected to time. And so even if we speak about the spatial intrusion or expansion, still some ideas of the future, some anticipated future, some possible scenarios are somehow folded into the idea of nanotechnologies, this temporal dimension. And probably this spatial topic and this temporal topic are very actively played out in the way nanotechnologies and emerging technologies are presented in the public sphere, so in the way they are communicated to the society, to the wider public. But it seems that, well, although there is such a careful deliberation how to present it to the public, still nanotechnologies seem to be very ambiguous, and this future scenarios and promises, well, do not fulfill in a way. Well, at least in Russia, nanotechnologies seem to be very, let's say, ambiguous or controversial, because there is an imbalance of promise and result. And in Russia, what is important probably is the connection or the background of some maybe even scandals connected to ineffective spending of money and this lack of visible result. So I wonder whether it's the same in the so-called West, in the US, in Europe, or is it like a special Russian thing? And the question that is connected to this is to what extent this spatial and temporal vision of nanotechnologies is a part of imaginary of technoscientists. So when they practice technoscience, when they practice nanotechnologies, do they read these meanings into that? Or is it more public communication narrative that is needed to transfer this knowledge from the lab to the wider society, to the policy sphere? And probably the last question would be, how can we see, and how can you comment on seeing other emerging technologies also as spatial things, like, for instance, synthetic biology? You mentioned that, I don't know, genetics, well, synthetic biology. So I will stop here, and I already asked some questions.
Well, thank you very much. This is, this actually helps considerably to kind of maybe sharpen and delimit a bit what I was talking about. So you start off by saying, this is classically a spatial term, right? To look at, in some sense, localities of knowledge production, of technological action, and how these different spaces maybe also generate different kinds of knowledge, different kinds of technologies, how you travel between these spaces and so forth. And all of that involves quite a sort of quite a bit of awareness and also attention to specific differences, right? So different localities condition the work in different ways. And of course, I talked about this here now in the most generic kind of way, right? So I talk about it really mostly in terms of, do we live in the cave, or do we try to historically emancipate ourselves and move beyond the cave? Or I talk about sort of history, versus kind of conquest of space, right? Do we historicize our narratives, or do we tell the story about colonization? So I actually miss out a lot of what you're talking about. But I think this in itself, this in itself might be actually part of the story that I'm telling. Because what is nanotechnology? What is left of nanotechnology, right? Especially since it didn't deliver any of those big promises of transforming human life and human society, right? And I think that's true everywhere. It's true in the West as well. And the big promises that nothing is as it was before just were not fulfilled. what remains is still something like something extremely generic, something extremely general, namely a kind of generalized ability to, in some sense, actually to level things out, to ease the movement between spaces that we might think are very different spaces, but that at the level of nanotechnology do not appear to be different spaces anymore. So in particular, to facilitate the movement between classical material science, physics, chemistry, on the one hand, and biology and biological systems, and information technological systems, right? I mean, the notion that somehow these are not distinct spheres, that they are not separate, but that they have, that we can, we develop certain techniques that can all inform each other, and that make, in some sense, space a very homogenized kind of space, where things become commensurate. So this, I think, is this very generic idea of very generalized abilities of looking at things, controlling things, manipulating things at the molecular level. That is what is left of nanotechnology. Right? But that is maybe also its legacy, if you might call it that. So it doesn't seem to be transgressive anymore, at least. Right? Which is again a reason why I think it's important to bring out these underlying hubris, you might call it, or the conceit, and the kind of program that consists in saying, okay, if only we develop these basic capacities of control, then suddenly everything becomes plastic, everything becomes commensurate, and we have this unbounded space of possibility in which we can, well, we don't know what we can do, but in fact we can't do very much if you look at the results of nanotechnology, but we can traffic somehow in a different way. And the politics that I'm describing, and this is the last point in answer to what you said, the politics that I'm describing are, of course, the politics of the early millennium, right? It's it's a very millennial kind of technology. It came around 1999, 2000, right? So this was supposedly the time where there was no ideological conflict anymore, right? The National Nanotechnology Initiative was very much an internationalized attempt to say, okay, now every nation in the world has to do the same thing, in the same mode, in fact. I mean, the leader of the American National Nanotechnology Initiative visited China and visited Japan. And for example, the inclusion of ethics as a part of nanotechnology was sort of exported from the United States to all these other countries. They were saying, you know, why should we do ethics? Well, we have to do it, right? It's part of the game, it's part of the package. We have to, in this form of internationalization, we have to all enter this new age together, right? So that's another aspect of this homogenization and this idea of making things commensurable, making differences and limits sort of disappear. It becomes a perfectly empty. It's a perfectly empty kind of program. But the strength lies in this emptiness, you might say. So yes, I think these are very important questions. But what I mostly want to resist is this: it's a space. It's a conquest of space that makes space in its particularity as a place. There's no place. There's only space.
Thank you for the presentation. I mean that it was quite complicated because here we're trying to read a lot about spatial term and all this stuff, but this was probably a way too much philosophical. I mean, I'm a philosopher, so I really glad to hear it, but it is really, I really need some time to understand. But so I want to clarify your last point, that there is no place, there is only space. What do you mean by that particularly?
Okay, so I mean, obviously there are different theories again about place and space and how they relate, right? But what I meant right now, also in response to Natalia's comment, is if you say place is a sort of a particular, where the location in space also has a kind of character, a kind of character of the particular that structures actions in a peculiar way. And what I see with this focus on emerging technologies, and I think it's already changing a little bit in the face of climate change, right, where you already have once again considerations of locality, where you are, and how climate change will actually impact the world that the researchers live in. Right? It starts playing a different role. But in the case of nanotechnology, it didn't even matter anymore where you come from intellectually, right? There is, even whether you are trained as a physicist or trained as a chemist or as an electrical engineer, right? There was almost an explicit effort to make these differences sort of disappear, right? And to create a universal access to this nanoscosm, right? This sphere between the classical and the quantum world, through techniques and through demonstrations of capability. So entering this new field, as Feynman was referring to it, you didn't bring your local traditions with you. You didn't do it from a certain point of view. Right? It becomes a rather kind of immersive exercise, right? You enter this. As you enter this new world, you leave. As you enter this space of the molecular, you leave all your traditional expectations behind. I think that is part of the conceit. There is no perspective from which to look at the nano world. So that's what I mean by the absence of place. And when we in the STS studies look at laboratories, for example, right, as structuring action in a certain way, right? So this might actually we tell differences about how research develops also differently. And here I think these stories become leveled out. So that's all I mean. I think it's maybe you expect that I mean more something more deep, more interesting.
No, I mean that it is quite interesting, but I mean I still have some problems with trying to reduce the discourse of future, this futureness of the discourse connected with the emergent technologies to the concept of space in this sense, because I thought about maybe so it is easier to explain like in terms not of space but utopia, because what you explain is it is somehow because place no place but space. So it sounds a little bit like utopia, and all that. So like Feynman with his ideas. So it is like a suggestion of a kind of utopia, because in utopia you don't have this perspective as in our world. So it is something completely different. I thought, in fact, when you said about the cave and going out of the cave. So because I thought about Plato and his utopia, and I mean that. maybe I mean that I'm not really sure that I understand your position, but I think that it could be incorporated in more general discussion about how how not to avoid utopia to be true, to find its place, because because the futureness of this discourse is not so easy. I don't understand how we can reduce it to the concept of place, of space.
Yeah.
But I think that it is much easier to reduce it to the concept of non-space, like utopia in this classical sense. And I don't know what you think about
Yeah.
it.
Actually, I mean, especially in those early days of nanotechnology, which is, I mean, now the years 2002 to 2008, right, roughly speaking, which is the time when these so-called promises of nanotechnology were still being taken rather seriously and discussed quite extensively. There was also a very explicit discussion about, is it a utopian discourse, right? Is it science fiction in the classical sense? And the diagnosis were even then immediately to say, first of all, one reason why it's not really conducive to science fiction is because there are no limits. Even a science fiction author needs, in some ways, a narrative constraint, a story of overcoming. And nanotechnology always is just about the fact that there are no such limits, that everything becomes fluid. And also with utopian discourse, I mean, there were some political theorists, and I can give you references if you like, who vehemently objected to saying that there's anything utopian about this, in part because it's the free play, the kind of empty play of possibility. And it was unconstrained by either ideas of societal need, or of actual technical feasibility, or of cost and decisions that we have to make in terms of choosing a certain way of life. None of that was present. It is just the sort of generic vision of everything becoming plastic, everything becoming subject to shaping. And that's exactly what I think my move is producing. Now, especially if we talk about nanotechnology, and I didn't even want to. I think nanotechnology is a thing of the past. You don't have to take it too seriously anymore. Just a nice example. But there were some theorists who said no one knows what nanotechnology is now. Nanotechnology is only defined by what it is supposed to do. Right? So we can give endless lists of things that will happen, that will be possible one day. Right? So one day we will have little computers that are fused with our brains. Talking about utopia, I saw little movies at the time where in Africa you have a computer that grows underground and it comes out in little villages and it sprouts like a tree in the village, and suddenly they have a video screen in the middle of the African village, and all these supposedly primitive people are now empowered to do all kinds of wonderful things. So these are crazy, crazy ideas. There were no limits to anything that they imagined. But this is the catalog of crazy ideas. This is what nanotechnology was. But once you start looking at just what it is, so to speak, right, it becomes this sort of empty sort of scheme. It's a scheme for generating promises. It's not any specific promise. It doesn't respond to anything, and again, it doesn't have any perspective. And that's why I'm quite serious about this idea of Plato in some ways, because there is a technology called the cave technology, which they use in nanotechnology and other contemporary simulation sciences. And it is where the epistemic dream of the researcher is just to become immersed in the world in the strange world of the atomic, of the molecular. So the cave environment is literally one where you don't have the distance of critical or theoretical reflection, but where you step into a three-dimensional space. Literally, it's a three-dimensional room, and you are inside the human cell or body, and you can pull on individual atoms, and you can feel their atomic forces and so forth and so on. So it's creating a kind of substitute world in which we learn how to maneuver, do things, and then it is almost an end in itself. So that's what I mean by. So it's not utopian in the sense of political theory, but it's sort of the end. It's just the dream of being able to do anything at all, or nothing, or nothing at all, right?
I mean that I thought about utopia in classical sense, again as Plato's sense. So I mean as classical political philosophy. I mean if we are talking about Plato and Aristotle, in this sense, I think so. As the very possibility, so as you said, it is the whole bunch of epistemic dreams about anything. I mean that was utopia in more general sense. So because utopian project, maybe they have boundaries, but I mean it is not, for me it is not so obvious, since it is neither in heavens nor on land, so you don't have any boundaries.
Well, I mean that would be an interesting discussion to have. I'm not sure whether among also political theorists and cultural historians, whether or not the idea of utopia and the idea of the kind of paradise where the birds just fly into your mouth or something like that, the cooked meals, and the cornucopia, where you live in a world of abundance, which how close these ideas were connected. I mean, I understood you as saying just now that this notion of unlimited possibility of immeasurable wealth and abundance, so to speak, is a kind of utopian thought.
Anti-utopian.
Or did I mishear you? What you said?
No. Well.
And we have had these dreams of I don't quite know the English word for it, but this form of paradise, right, where everything exists in abundance and all my wishes get fulfilled instantaneously, right? But these fictitious dreams, I thought, in my mind, were always rather distinct from political utopias, which were structured along some notion of the good, or the good life, or virtue, or whatever you want.
And does all that means the end of the science?
Yes, yeah. So, to make it a short answer, I mean, I don't think that there is no such thing as science anymore. Just as I also don't think that there is. I mean, obviously there are ideas of enlightenment, right, in political theory, which is actually one reason why I said it's so difficult for me to move to say the political aspect of the technosciences are in the way in which they seek to control and organize space. It's difficult for me because I am, in my background, in my mind, still socialized as an Enlightenment subject, right, who thinks that politics is oriented towards some notion of, as I just said, the good life or whatever, and some notion of, perhaps, carefully speaking, human progress or enlightenment, whatever. So we haven't given up on these ideas, and I think scientists are not giving up on the idea that science is about seeking truth and understanding and explaining how things are, but this kind of work is just of a different kind, and I think the tension. I think we can all be aware of this tension, and my project is in part, again, to make it as powerful as possible, so we can actually talk about this, the differences, and we have to discuss this question about, for example, how satisfied will we be to enter a kind of management scheme, or to what extent do we expect some notions of, intellectual control and understanding. So the control that you're talking about, right? It's not so much intellectual control; it's physical control.
For me, it sounds
And these two things can.
rather frightening.
Yeah, I hope. This is fully my intention to kind of show also the frightening side of this picture. But at the same time, it's seductive enough that I would say, I say this for the Western civilization now, more or less for Western Europe. I don't know to what extent Russia is impacted and included. I don't want to judge too quickly, but I think while we are all hesitant to endorse such a hedonistic vision, it is still, most people would say, our only hope. This is what, when we look at, how will humanity save itself, how will we progress, how will we manage to somehow survive? Well, we hope that technology will somehow do it.
And the idea of control, is it popular? For many post-Soviet people, it's frightening, actually.
The idea of control, yeah.
Yes.
That's a very good question. The discourse is, of course, often not, the word control is not used so much. But when we look at the big data sciences, as another example, right? It's all about being able to make very accurate predictions on the basis of a very complex collection of data without necessarily making the processes, the theories, amenable to kind of critical discussion. Right? So the only criterion is the kind of robustness of the system. Right? So it produces more or less reliably the results that we can all kind of live with, or that we do, in fact, kind of live with. And is this control? Is this something to be afraid of? I think most people do not see the interested party. We don't see the technocrat. We don't see the economic interest behind it. And indeed, it may not be so easy to name the interests, right? This was also one of the stories of nanotechnology. It began with the many people compared it to genetically modified organisms and genetically modified food. But there was a clear economic interest. We were able to name companies, Monsanto and so forth, who had an agenda and who wanted to, in some sense, privatize seeds and capitalize or certain kinds of very simple agrarian practices. Right? So there was a very clear sort of notion, here's the enemy, so to speak, or here's the interested party. With nanotechnology, no one to this day knows in whose interest this is actually involved. Maybe in Russia with charges of corruption and so forth, maybe it's a different story, but we don't have, so it seems too generic even for that. But at the same time, the mode of operation is one which aims for creating technical structures that become validated through the way in which they work, and not through any kind of other form of scrutiny, either political or intellectual. So that is something to worry about, but I think it's a much more subtle form of. No, you don't agree?
I'm not a
Okay.
philosopher, actually.
Okay.
I'm
No,
a historian
Okay.
of science, yes, and I'm always looking from that point of view.
Okay.
And just processing the big data. It has to be a point of control because we couldn't tell even if the program processing those data, is it right or is it leading astray to some wrong conclusions. I look at people working with big data, just bioinformatics, and sometimes it happens that the program they relied on is not working properly, and so they receive results that are just trash, I should say. So we have to be somehow so we need some help to control those things, and in your world there would be nothing controlling.
Well, I mean, the
And so,
question
and
is, no,
we
yeah,
will see
yeah,
the
yeah.
results that we never foresee,
Yeah.
like modern tomatoes
Yeah.
that has no scent
Yeah.
because they
Yeah.
were. Because that
Yeah.
was the result of the selection for their
Yeah.
better storage.
I think I don't think I think we just need to talk longer. I think we will agree in the end. So there is, especially. I mean, your example is a beautiful example. I think because of course, yes, we are looking at the way in which the systems work, right? And we can see whether or not they work according to expectations, which are often enough. Do they deliver? You know, do they make accurate predictions? Are they reliable in their output and so forth, whatever, right? And then we often find that, you know, there's something wrong with the program, it's trash, it's producing trash. So we optimize, the program gets optimized, tuned, adapted in all kinds of ways to perform better, right? And now you are perfectly right to say this idea of what it means to perform better. We have to institute some notion of, you know, what do we optimize towards, right? So what is the performance that we're trying to achieve, right? And there is a kind of form of, you might say, this is a controlling idea. There's a controlling. It's for the design cycles, optimization processes. There are some controlling ideas of this would be nice to have, right? It would be nice to have a computer model that simulates the climate. You know, it would be nice to have a cell that can make these kinds of switches, or and so on and so forth, right? So there's always some idea of what it is that we want to attain. But where do these ideas actually come from? I mean, that's I think a much harder question to answer. I think some of them come from these generic notions of sustainability, right? Which again are almost empty notions, right? They set a framework for kind of social acceptability. So if it seems to be more efficient, then it's a good thing, right? If it seems to be whatever, I mean, so sustainability gives a large framework for people developing all kinds of ideas of what might be a beneficial thing to have. And then they come up with crazy things in between. But very rarely do these crazy things actually elicit some kind of discussions of justification or legitimacy. So ultimately there's this larger question always: what works, what doesn't work? Does it seem to somehow fit into the larger scheme of our social economic development?
In my mind, it leads to some totalitarian order.
Well, yeah, but who? Yeah, I agree. I mean, there is something.
And I hate it.
No, I think I agree with you on that too. I mean, that this design cycle, what makes it totalitarian is in part because it does not acknowledge any resistance. There's nothing outside. So-called when something doesn't work, or when it's just always considered a kind of constraint that gets incorporated into the design process. So it's totally oblivious to social conflict, right? So, and also the process of social participation that accommodate these things always are on the premise that not so much shall we have it or not, but how can we all contribute to the beneficial making of it, right? So everything gets incorporated into this design process, which is ultimately an optimization process. And to optimization to what? To a kind of functioning within a kind of order, none of which is actually questioned. So the whole thing is, in some sense, totalitarian. But what is missing in this totalitarian scheme, to my mind, is the kind of individual kind of ruler, or the kind of dominating interest. I mean, the dominating interest is, I mean, as we, so we create a kind of very homogenized world without maybe a brave new world, but without any actually propagandists for it. I mean, it's
Maybe I have to